Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video, and today we're doing a Nikon 35mm comparison between their brand new 35mm f1.4 and their 1.8 S prime lens. I don't actually have it with me. We'll get to that in a second. So Nikon released their brand new 35mm f1.4 and it came out last week for $599. Which is a crazy price for a 1.4 lens. And it's also throwing kind of a wrench into what we normally think of lenses. Let me explain. Camera manufacturers usually release 2 or 3 lines of different lenses, and their 1.8 primes or their 2.0 primes are usually like in the budget range. And then you have the 1.4 and 1.2 primes at their premium professional range. Well, Nikon started the Z mount and completely changed the approach and released a Pro line of 1.8 prime lenses. Then they started releasing their Pro line of 1.2 lenses with one focal length missing, the 35mm. Well, Nikon then surprised everybody and released a budget-friendly 35mm f1.4 that does not fall into their Pro line and happens to be $250 cheaper than their 1.8 S prime. I don't think a manufacturer's ever taken this strategy. It's different, but I'm here for it. Cheap 1.4 primes, I will take it all day long. So for this comparison, I wanted to focus on 2 things: build quality and image quality. So after picking this lens up, I immediately went and rented a 1.8 for this comparison. That's why I don't have it with me. But I did get some B-roll and I will show you some of that. So let's start off with build quality. Taking a look at the 35mm f1.4, this lens is made entirely out of plastic. It has a plastic focusing ring and it does have a control ring, which is actually new to Nikon lenses, I believe. At least it's not present in the 1.8 primes. This lens is weather resistant, not weather sealed, which means it's only protected for light splashes and dust. Now, the 1.8 S prime lens is made out of metal and plastic. It has a metal focusing ring and an autofocus manual focus switch. This lens is also weather sealed. So when you look at those features, the S prime lens does have the more pro body and weather sealing. That's where the extra $250 comes in. I will say though, even though the 1.4 is made entirely out of plastic, it doesn't necessarily feel cheap, and they both feel good in the hands. Obviously, when looking at this comparison, the 1.8 is going to win here because of its weather sealed design, which means you can use it in the rain or any environment and feel totally comfortable with a weather sealed body. But what about image quality? Like I mentioned, we're going to do a pixel peeping session. So let's go ahead and dig into Lightroom and see the differences between these 2 lenses. Let's kick off this comparison. We will start off with some edited files, but for the most part, we will be using raw files for this comparison. I use a Nikon Z8 on a tripod, and I use the exact same settings on all these images. Starting off, we're going to see these images here edited with my preset with the exact same settings and exact same white balance, so we can see some of the differences. On the left-hand side, we have the 1.4 at 1.4, and on the right-hand side, we have the 1.8 at 1.8. And off the bat, you're going to see how much more contrasty the 1.8 is. You don't even have to zoom in to see how much sharper the 1.8 is, just based on the contrast it's rendering here in the face and skin. The 1.4 is a cooler lens and also has a glow wide open. I personally love that. It reminds me of a vintage lens, and for skin tones, I think it looks great. It's a lot more flattering than the contrast and the sharpness on skin, but you can always dial it back or use a filter here on the 1.8. Zooming in, you're going to see that the 1.8 is sharper, and like I mentioned, a lot more contrast. You're also going to notice here on the earring on the 1.8, it's rendered perfectly fine, but on the 1.4, you're already seeing green fringing. Spoiler alert, the 1.4 shows a lot of green fringing. Looking at the bokeh balls, you're going to see that at 1.4, they do look a little bit bigger. They are all outlined with some green fringing here on the 1.4. The 1.8 still does showcase some green fringing, but not as much. Overall, at 1.4, you do get a blurrier background, more subject separation, and that 1.4 look. But the question is, what if you stop down the 1.4 to 1.8? Does it do better? Let's take a look. So looking at the 1.4 at 1.8 here on the left, you're going to see that it does sharpen up a bit. You do get more contrast if you stop it down to 1.8. If you zoom in, you're going to see that it is contrastier, but not as much as the 1.8. The 1.8 is still a sharper and more contrasty lens. And keep in mind, the 1.8 is wide open here, and the 1.4 is stopped down a little bit. The background blur still looks better on the 1.4, I think. Even though it's at 1.8, the bokeh balls are bigger and a little bit more circular, and overall just a better background look. So just based on these images, and you're going to see the trend as we look at more, if you want contrast, if you want sharpness, the 1.8 lens is the one to go with. But let's continue looking at some images, this time some raw files. For these images, we have the 1.4 on the left at 1.4 and the 1.8 on the right at 1.8. You're going to see again that the 1.8 is sharper, more contrasty. This is a raw file, it's unedited, so you can't see the contrast difference as much as you can when I edited the files. And you're also going to see here that the 1.4 does have more background blur. Zooming in, you're going to see that the 1.8 again is sharper, more contrasty, but I personally like the rendering here of the 1.4. You're getting some of that glow again. It's a little bit softer on the skin, and I think it's more pleasing. Zooming out, one thing that stands out, and some people are going to either love this or hate this, it's the background blur. If you zoom in, you're going to see that the 1.4 almost renders like a vintage lens. You get that soap bubble bokeh, and I personally like it a lot. It reminds me of my Leica 50mm Summicron, and I like this rendering personally. It has some character to it. But zooming back out, you're going to see here again, the 1.8 is sharper and contrastier. Let's go ahead and look at the 1.4 stop down to 1.8 to see how they compare. Here we have the 1.4 on the left at 1.8, and again, the 1.8 on the right at 1.8. Zooming in, they're both sharp. The 1.8 is still sharper, still more contrast. And you can see that the 1.4, even stopped down a little bit, still retains some of that character and that soap bubble bokeh. Again, I like it, but not everybody will. Wanted to showcase that. Let's look at a few more images. Again, here on the left, we're going to have the 1.4 at 1.4 and the 1.8 at 1.8 on the right. Another thing to point out is the 1.8 is a tad bit wider. I'm not sure which one of these lenses is a 35 or if one of them is a little bit longer or one of them is a little bit shorter, but you're going to see here that on the 1.8, you are getting more on the left-hand side and the right-hand side versus the 1.4. Zooming in, you're going to notice that, again, the 1.8 is sharper, more contrast, and the 1.4 has a nice small glow to the skin and to the highlights. The background blur is not that much of a difference if you think about it. 1.4 to 1.8 is 2/3 of a stop, so it's not a crazy difference. So if you're looking to have a dramatic improvement of background blur, you're not going to get that, but you are going to get a very different look. Let's go ahead and look at a few more images. What kind of comparison would this be if we didn't have a picture of a wall? So I figured I'd include one. We have the 1.4 at 1.4 on the left, the 1.8 at 1.8 on the right. And again, you're going to see that the 1.8 is a wider lens. You can see the sign here. I think it says restrooms on the right-hand side where you can't see it on the 1.4. These were shot with a tripod. Zooming in, you're going to notice that the 1.8 is sharper. Tons more detail here on the lettering, on the paint. The 1.4 is showcasing purple fringing here on the SATX lettering versus the 1.8 is showcasing zero purple fringing. And you can just see that the 1.8 is a sharper lens. Let's take a look at the 1.4 stop down. So on the left-hand side, we have the 1.4 stop down to 1.8. Zooming in, you're going to see that at 1.8, it does sharpen up and you do get a bit more contrast, but nowhere near as much as the 1.8. And again, the 1.8 is wide open. At 1.8, you still see purple fringing on the 1.4 here on the lettering. And it is just a thing you're going to have to deal with if you want to pick up the 1.4. Let's look at two more images. So for this image, again, the 1.4 is on the left wide open, the 1.8 is on the right wide open. We're going to zoom into where I focus, which was somewhere around here. And you're going to see from a sharpness perspective, again, the 1.8 is just rendering more detail. And if you go to the top here, you're going to see, again, that the 1.4 does showcase purple fringing. The 1.8 isn't perfect. You still see purple fringing, but nowhere near as much as the 1.4. As a matter of fact, here you can see how the 1.8 is still sharp, and the 1.8 starts getting that glow to the lens, to the look of it. As far as background blur, in this image here, you're going to see that 1.4 and 1.8 isn't that big of a difference. You do get a creamier background, but nothing crazy. One thing to note here again, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, the bokeh on the 1.4 is, I mean, you can call it busy. It has tons of character. Again, it reminds me of a vintage lens. I personally love the rendering of this 1.4 lens, and it's because of those characteristics. Anyways, let's look at one more image shot at night, and then we'll wrap up this comparison. So here is a trippy image. I thought the lights would look cool. The 1.4 is on the left, the 1.8 is on the right. Both are wide open. Again, you're gonna see that with the tripod, they haven't moved. The 1.8 is a wider lens. You're getting more in the frame. The 1.4, you can see the background blur. You do get more. You can see the roof here is just blown out. So you really can't tell what's going on, versus the 1.8, you can kind of separate the fact that these are lights here, or I'm not sure actually. It's something, but you can tell it's something. Zooming in, you're going to notice that the 1.8 is sharper, more contrasty. But again, like when you think about the 1.4, it's not sharp. It's just not as sharp as the 1.8. You're not really sacrificing much, but you are going for a look. I think with that said, though, let's go ahead and wrap up our thoughts. All right, so what did y'all think? The 1.8 lens is clearly the sharper lens, has more contrast, and then when you factor in build quality with its plastic and metal build and weather seal design, it checks off all the boxes for it to be the more premium lens, and it justifies its $250 premium over this 1.4. But does that make the 1.4 a bad lens? I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I'm going to steal a quote from Matt Irwin, who's a Nikon photographer, and he does tons of great quality videos here on YouTube. And he said there's no longer any bad lenses. There's just different levels of good. I love that because it kind of applies here. I personally love the 1.4, and I love it because of its imperfections. I love its vintage rendering. I love its glow wide open. And to me, that inspires me to want to use it. Hear me out, because I haven't really talked about this much in other videos, and I really kind of want to drive the message home. When you look at the 1.8 S prime lens, it's a phenomenal performer. I think Nikon is shooting for perfection with their S prime lenses. Sony also has a line where they're shooting for perfection called the G Master line. Canon also has a line, the L series line. And then Leica has their line, their Apple line. And then you have Sigma and other manufacturers. But when you have every manufacturer shooting for perfection, with today's technology, they're getting super close. You start getting a line of lenses across all manufacturers that start looking very similar. They're all clinical, they're all extremely sharp, they're all kind of boring. When you shoot for perfection and you get perfection, kind of just meh. Every lens starts looking the same, every lens starts rendering the same, and at that point, I just start feeling uninspired. And having this 1.4 lens that has some vintage characteristics, like I mentioned, it has that soap bubble bokeh. It has that slight, small glow shot wide open. It has character. It's different. And I love that about the 1.4 lens. Now, I understand. Sometimes when you're shooting professionally, you don't want different. You don't want to glow. You don't want vintage background. You want perfection. You want sharp, contrasty images. And if that's what you need and crave, Nikon has that 1.8, and that's the one to go with. But if you want to break from the norm, if you want something different, some character in your lens, this 1.4 is an incredible value at $500, I think $96, weird price. And it performs great. So what do you think? As always, guys, I will be providing images for you to download and check out yourself so you can do this comparison. Let me know your thoughts down below. If you're new to the channel, smash the like button, hit subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good one, guys. Peace.